Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points. So, today we're going to talk a little bit about American culture. This is an idea that my co host Matt came up with. I think it's going to be an interesting conversation because if you listen to the last episode where we talked about the media, I am very critical of certain types of extrapolations or narratives, and when I hear a phrase like American culture, I start sounding like a college postmodernist that is kind of going on some sort of tangent about epistemology and what we can actually say. And even if we do say it, what extent does it matter or mean? So we may try to ground this. I'm going to let Matt kind of steer the wheel a little bit on this one, but expect a lot of me going on long rants about how we should be skeptical of how much we know and stuff like that. And I think and I wanted to lead with that because that is the kind of episode we're going to have. I'm not going to avoid going on that tangent because sometimes we've done a few episodes where we get 30 minutes in, and my co-host here who puts up with all the garbage I say, he'll say something and it'll make me want to go on like a 20-minute side route about what we can really know. When he suggested we talk about American culture, I pretty much led with, well, this is the side tangent I'm going to want to go on. So I'm giving everybody the heads up. We're going to have that kind of argument. And I think it is worth fleshing out because I think it's important to have at least thought about that a little bit before you go into the media landscape we exist in. So I think this will be interesting to talk about it in this context. So I'll pass it over to you, Matt. You can talk a little bit about why you wanted to talk about this, and we'll go from there. And we'll see how far we can get before I totally start being obstructive. But I think it'll be fun. So bear with us as we argue and debate.
So I guess I'll begin by saying that I do think there is such a thing as culture, in the sense that you can have a collection of or you can have a large group of people. They often share a common language. They often share a common religion. They often share certain kind of values or beliefs or a certain value structure. So that's really just the basic my basic claim when I'm saying when I say there is such a thing as American culture. Obviously, of course, there are groups are made up of individuals, but also there are just variations within one culture. So obviously there are nuances, and I will try to preserve the nuances as they come. But being a patriotic American like I am, I just like to think. I like to think about just the American value system, American history, just the way Americans think and think. Obviously, we stem from, or American culture, I guess you could say, stems partly from British culture or English culture. But obviously, being our own separate country now, we kind of developed our own culture. And when I say culture, of course, I'm referring to everything from language to the arts to religion and just different philosophies. Basically, just everything that kind of at some level distinguishes different groups of people across the world, or rather everything, or things related to everyday life that kind of distinguish groups of people. Meaning, of course, that even though a Frenchman and a German, even though they're both human and so they share a lot in common, there are also differences. So that's really my basic thesis. It's not to say that there aren't nuances. It's not to say that culture, that I'm just making blanket statements. But I do think there is you can make basic statements and preserve the nuances at the same time, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
So I think it's interesting to talk about this because I think it breaks down in a lot of ways somewhat rapidly. Because what we try to describe when people use the phrase American culture is the on average preferences of some typical, like a quote unquote typical American or something like that. So it'll be a lot of traits that are reflected by either like a plurality or a majority of Americans or something of the sort. Um, the issue I find with it is a lot of times, I mean, I think there is a way to say there is an American culture. I just don't think once you've identified it, it is applicable enough to enough people for it to be a useful thing as a concept. So that's where I have a lot of hesitancy. So maybe I should give an example of why I'm hesitant to ascribe an American culture in a way that is useful or to a degree that it's useful. Well, so to some extent, pretty much anybody who'd be listening to this podcast, if they're in the United States, you expected it to be in English, right? So we do have a shared language. But beyond that, me and my co-host here, of the things you laid out, like off the top of your head, when it comes to like arts and religion, and I would add in things like entertainment, like we don't necessarily have a lot of overlap. You and I have like very different intuitions, and me and a lot of Americans that even have similar backgrounds to me have very different intuitions about things like freedom, things we talked about on the show a lot. And then when it comes to things like the arts, I see like wildly different views a lot of the time. Because you could say there are huge blockbuster movies like superhero movies, but then if you actually talk about how many people went and saw those movies, I don't think 50% of Americans went and saw the most recent superhero movie. It's like some subset of people that seems like a lot in our society. So then we ascribe these things that, although they seem prevalent in our culture, in the end, they still usually describe at best a slight majority. So how much value can we really draw from these things? Another example could be when we talk about, say, that Thanksgiving just passed and that there's a football on Thanksgiving. It's a famous tradition. And football gets very high ratings for sports in the United States compared to other sports. But with that said, a lot of people could not care less about football. And there's a huge gender divide about people caring about football as well. So it's like, despite football being a huge sport in the United States, a huge proportion of Americans probably could not care less about the football games that came on Thanksgiving. So I guess what I would say is I'm very slow to ascribe any characteristics to something that isn't representative of the population it describes. So if we're talking about American culture, and then a lot of things would come to people's minds like sports that are famous in America. Well, a lot of Americans could not care less about sports at all, period. So I'm like, how useful of a heuristic is this phrase? And I would say it either depends on the topic or it's probably not useful. That's where I start from.
So I think it's relevant though that you kind of began, or we one of the things we brought up at first was language. That's not that's not a trivial thing. That you can live in Washington State or Nebraska or Pennsylvania or Florida, and you share a common language. I'm not going to get into like the philosophy of language and whatnot, but it's your language basically is your world. It's how you think. It's how you process information. It's how you come up with a lot of concepts. Thinking and language are extremely linked. As many linguists will tell you, we actually have a very unique picture of like language in the United States because of how homogeneous it is. If you go to somewhere like Italy, for example, Italian varies far more widely than American English does. So there are people in Italy that they're both speaking Italian, but they basically can't understand each other. And then of course you get into like the the Italian literary standard, which is basically it's like a totally different language at some level, whereas the literary standard in English is not very different from language that you and I would learned as children in the home. So that's kind of my starting point. Really, is a shared language presupposes certain like shared ideas or beliefs, just because, as I said, just because of how connected language is with thought. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I see that point. I think that's a relevant point. I think that's worth noting, and I don't disagree with anything you just laid out. I think the issue with that in the context of the conversation or the context of the idea of American culture is typically when people use that phrase, they are ascribing a lot more than just we all use the same vernacular and it doesn't have wide variance across a huge swath of land and a huge amount of people. And it's like, yeah, I agree. It's worth noting for all those reasons. And when I encounter a random person, even if I moved across country completely, and really only a handful of words changed, right? So it's like, okay, that isn't negligible. So I'll see that. But anytime you're watching, the news and somebody says, well, the reason why we won't have this policy is because in America there's this culture. This American culture does this. It's like, well, they're clearly talking about something beyond language. So it's like, yeah, I agree, you're right, but I don't agree that that is how people typically use the phrase that I'm contesting.
So, this might be where I start making more, or start using using generalizations or making general statements that you can push back on. But I know I do think you're right. In you're right in that that's how the phrase American culture is used. But I would still say it's justified. I was just laying like language is just kind of the foundation of culture at some level. So that was just like that's like the bedrock. That's the start of any conversation about culture is the language. But I think it goes beyond that. It, you know, okay, well, religion isn't something else we mentioned. America is, it's not like officially a Christian nation, but most Americans consider themselves Christian. Most Americans find some value in Christian teachings and Christian thought. Of course, Christianity, because we were settled by Europeans, that is why we were Christian nation, because Christianity Christianity originally came, I guess, from the Middle East, but then it became the dominant religion across the European continent. But then, then you get into like the history of America, the history of the United States. Again, some of our cultural ideas derived from Britain, or from the United Kingdom, rather. But of course, we, as everyone knows, we broke away from Britain, partly over cultural differences. You could say those cultural differences were small or trivial at some level, but they didn't seem small or trivial to the founding fathers who wanted to break away in the first place. And then we get into like a broader conversation. When we start to include, the entertainment and the arts. So there was a time when there was no there was a time when there was no such thing as American literature. But there definitely is an American literary tradition now, which is separate from the English-speaking literary tradition in places such as India or the United Kingdom. There's now, there's a tradition, of film, American film, American music. That's of course slightly. There's like those. Sorry, I'm stuttering. So these are two slightly different conversations. I brought up the history, then I started bringing up like art and entertainment. So we can take one at a time. We can start, I guess, with the historical points that I just brought up.
Yeah. So I pulled up a quick Pew Pew research, so some information they had on like the identification with religion, and to some extent I think that's relevant, and to some extent I don't think that's relevant. So, for example, this is the Ben Shapiro argument of America is based on Judeo-Christian values, et cetera, and a lot of things that we take for granted, such as people being treated as, I guess Kant would say, ends of themselves. Um, that is kind of based on some level of monotheist religious thoughts, at least its historical origins. Now, I think that's like a point that you can make, and it's kind of hard to disagree with it, because you can easily cite, well, yeah, the United States has had a generally Catholic, Christian, some sort of majority in these certain holy books and their beliefs. So it's like I guess that's true, but you're kind of it's kind of making the claim more that the actual religious identification isn't as important as the assumptions within the religious identification. And I guess the reason why I think this breaks down so quick is, well, and it's kind of even ignoring the religious identification part. I don't need to cite this Pew article because I don't think that's relevant. I shouldn't have brought that up at all. So when we're talking about the ideas that stem from these Western Judeo-Christian values and ascribing them to the subset of things under American culture and saying that this is prevalent, the problem is you can agree generally with a basic intuition and maybe potentially call that basic intuition an American value, but a lot of people either completely push back against that, or take that intuition to completely different degrees, to where in life it doesn't generally, you can't really draw assumptions from it based on society ascribing to these low level intuitions. So you're probably thinking, okay, Matt, well, what the hell did you just say? I guess what I'm saying is you can take away the value that individuals are important from basic from the basic from the basic tradition of these holy books, right? You can take away that the individual is important. Okay, well, I'll talk to you and I'll say that I'm pretty much a radical when it comes to being anti-government, because I think it dehumanizes the individual, and I don't think it respects the individual. So I'm taking these intuitions that you can ascribe to American culture, but I'm taking a radical position that describes almost nobody, right? A fraction of a percent of people in the country would identify something similar to me in terms of the political landscape. So, but then there are people who are on the political left who could value the individual, and then they can try to make a good faith argument about how they're caring for people based on these similar, I guess I put in quotes, first principles, and then argue for everything that I find abhorrent. So it's like, okay, well, you can say that we both have this background that is historically in the Western tradition, and to some extent we both value individualism. But then I would say, but to what degree we do, or in what circumstances we do, is completely different, to the point that us having the same tradition isn't that noteworthy, because in the end we still disagree on everything. So once even if you start at the same point, after each of us do the math, we get an answer that is about as far apart as possible. I mean, I guess it's not as far apart as possible, but it's very far. So at best, American culture bounds the first part, and it's like, well, that's not very useful. And all of that is assuming that people agree with Ben Shapiro's argument that we're all based on Judeo-Christian values, which I don't have like the historical background to really think about that in a super, high degree way. So I'm just accepting that as true. But I know some people dispute that, and although I probably wouldn't agree with those people, just based on the kinds of people that make that argument, and they don't usually have sound arguments on other issues, I don't want to dismiss them completely out of hand, since I don't know their case. So that's the religion side of things that you can go for, and then we'll get to the arts later.
So this kind of goes back to an earlier point I made, which can be summed up in the phrase "man is a historical animal." Um, the thing that like kind of in some sense connects you and I is history. So I don't know exactly your genealogy, and I don't even know my genealogy very well, but I know a couple things. I can know a couple things, at least to a degree. So I know our ancestors, at least for a while, spoke English, or we wouldn't be speaking English right now. Um, I know that our ancestors were probably Christian of some kind, most likely Protestant, because we live in a Protestant-dominated country. Um, I know that our ancestors were European. Now, of course, Europe is a continent with many different countries and many different cultures. But Europeans, of course, they also share they also share there are similarities between various Europeans as well. That I'm not going to make a I'm not going to make an argument about European culture, because that does kind of take the cultural argument to an extreme. When I talk about culture, I am thinking more in the geographical boundaries of a country. So like American culture, French culture, Canadian culture, etc. But because you and I share this history, this allows you and I to have certain kinds of conversations that it would be difficult to have if we did not share that history. So I would have a hard time talking to somebody, say, who lives in Saudi Arabia and their families lived in Saudi Arabia for generations. Putting aside like the the language barrier, of course, if we didn't have a language barrier, we would probably have a somewhat difficult time having a conversation, at least about like certain important, like the deep, like important philosophical issues, or like it might be hard to have a conversation about values at some level, in the sense that we come from so radically different backgrounds. Again, not to say that cross-cultural conversations or dialogue cannot happen. Of course it can, and it should. But it is a challenge because culture is so ingrained in us, and because history is so ingrained in us. That really, like, you and I share culture in that in the sense that we share history. Which you and I don't share with someone from China, let's say, or from Japan, or even from certain Latin American countries. That's really, I guess, the way I would describe it.
So I would say when it comes to any kind of intellectual conversation about values that might be informed by quote unquote culture, I think it's easier for us to have conversations maybe because we're more likely to base on average, we'd more likely agree with each other than maybe you and I versus another person from, say, Sudan on values. Maybe that's possible on average. Yeah. I think, but here's the thing. Most people in the United States of America do not regularly have high-level conversations about values. I'm pretty sure. Because most people don't engage in unnecessary intellectual discourse. So it's like, how descriptive is saying American culture when a lot of people just take things for granted and don't really talk about it? Now, the other thing that was coming to mind that isn't necessarily about values, but it's about like, okay, well, you and I are going to be more on average likely to have things in common than us and somebody who's, from the Middle East. But then I'm like, imagining you, as you were talking, having this conversation with a random person that's in the neighborhood I live in, which is in a a very low income area, a very low income urban area, where as you were saying, things that we have in common. I'm like, well, if you're looking at background in 2 generations, you and I don't have really anything in common with most of the people that live around me. If you're going to look at things on that surface level, so if we're bounding things by geography of the United States and talking about American culture, it's like, okay, you're comparing you and we are actually like we're pretty similar in terms of like coming from a middle class background and going to okay schools and both being college students or recent college students. But it's like, okay, well, if you compare a kid growing up in the suburbs of California versus a person growing up in the low income neighborhood in urban cities, then it's like, what American culture do those people typically share? And it's like, well, yeah, if you go back 2 generations and they're both in the United States, they both lived through the same cultural events, but that they probably have almost no overlap in terms of any of their habits, because those types of demographics generally have different religious tendencies. And if they do have the same religious tendencies, it's kind of in name only because they practice them very different. They usually have different types of family structures, and they usually watch very different things for entertainment. And they usually go to different qualities of schools and educations and have different lives with their family around. So it's like, okay, it's easy to compare you and I in the base case, and we may be on average similar. But it's like, okay, but what do we do with a non-negligible percent that probably have the most minimal overlap possible? And that's where I think things completely fall apart, because then you start disenfranchising groups by generally talking about the on average American culture, because it's like, well, then they don't really count. So that's what was coming to mind to me, because everything you were saying about if you had a conversation with somebody in like Sudan, I was thinking like, well, that would still apply if you talk to somebody in a very urban area that has almost no similar experience to you and almost no similar background to you. I don't see why that'd be an easier conversation than somebody from the Middle East. So, except for like very few things. So, so clear that up for me a little bit.
I guess I would want to make a distinction then between individual or the different life experiences of individuals versus the shared or generally shared history. Because me and Bill Gates and a hobo who lives down the street, we might have extremely different life experiences, but that does not mean, as John Donne says, no man is an island. That doesn't mean that we don't have similarities. That doesn't mean we have very entrenched similarities, or we don't have very deep or profound similarities. I mean, I'm trying to think of another way to phrase it, but it's just I keep going back to history. History, unfolds for various reasons, and I mean, well, here okay. I think I can like talk about it in a slightly different way. Okay, so like, why do we have countries? Why do countries exist at all? And okay, someone might say, well, it's because people conquer stuff, and they say, this is my land now, and these are the borders, and you're going to do what I say because I'm the ruler now. That's obviously part of it. But another part of it has to do with the fact that people who live in the same area often share similar struggles. They often have similar experiences. They generally have the speak the same language. Again, similar religion, similar value system. It's like, and this almost gets into things like, I guess, the term of cultural evolution, but it's like, as humans spread out all across the globe, people who were who lived in the same area, formed these common bonds through common experiences, and ultimately countries were formed. again, it doesn't have to be an either or conversation. It's not as if everyone is the same or everyone is completely different. And I'm not saying that's not what you're saying, of course, but I'm just making that clear. You can have even extreme differences within members of a group or members of a particular country. People. I don't know. Let's take France as an easy example because I'm a Francophile. But it's like people who vote for Marine Le Pen, and people who vote for Macron are they definitely want to take France in a very different direction. But I am an American. Okay, so people who voted for Joe Biden and people who voted for Donald Trump, again, both of them wanted to take the country in a very different direction. But here's the interesting thing. America, of course, has had political parties basically since Washington got out of office. And I think the fact that we have two political parties is evidence of a shared outlook on life, because both parties they have certain foundations that they share in common. The Republicans and the Democrats, there are certain presuppositions that they both share. Now that and of course, we had a conversation like a couple episodes ago about how different are the political parties, and there are differences, of course. But I think they wouldn't be political parties in this country if people didn't have similar outlooks or similar intuitions or presuppositions. Republicans and Democrats are they're both going to say that they want freedom. They're both going to say that they want a society where people like certain. Okay, let me put it like this. Then I'll let you jump in. It's like the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. It's like generally, I guess you could say it's conservatives who are like constantly praising the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. But like, name me a single Democrat or Republican that's elected that's going to be like, yeah, I don't like that freedom of speech amendment. Yeah, I don't like that freedom of religion amendment. I don't like the freedom of assembly amendment. You're not going to find them. You're not going to find those kind of people because they don't exist. If you're a politician in this country, you probably think that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights are, documents worth emulating, worth preserving. That they have ideas that should be perpetuated. So that's almost another way to look at it. The fact that we have two parties in this country with similar intuitions, I think, goes along with my argument about the existence of an American culture.
So a lot of the points I'm trying to make are, if this term exists, how much do you have to bound it, and then how useful is it actually? Because it's like, I'd be willing to see that you can make some definition, but then I'm not necessarily willing to see that it's that it's actually useful and descriptive. So if we lay out things that are descriptive of a lot of people in America, but then like it clearly doesn't apply to a certain population, then it's like, okay, this is American culture, and I use the phrase American culture, but I also have to remember that completely like doesn't include a large portion of Americans that stray from it. Right. So if we're talking about, say, the two-party system, and we're talking about how a lot of people have historically voted for people that say they're in favor of freedom, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, and it's not politically palatable to say that you're anti-freedom, even if somebody can argue that your positions are anti-freedom, then it's like, okay, you can argue that's American culture. But then you have to remember that, like, even if Joe Biden got historic voter turnout, a ton of people don't vote. So you can say, well, if you look at the trends in American culture, the American tradition is not voting, because most people that are Americans don't vote. Most Americans don't participate in elections. So what I'm saying is, you walk this thin line of, it's very easy to construct conflicting narratives about the same country and then ascribe it to American culture. You can say America has a tradition based on how they left Britain, and you can say things based on history. And then you can say, and I could make, and you can make claims from it. Here's another example. I could say that it's American tradition and American culture is going to a lot of public schools that are taught in a style where kids are supposed to be obedient to their teachers. And I could say that a lot of people go to work where they're obedient to a boss. So American culture plays into this history of obedience. And then somebody could go, well, no, America has high levels of entrepreneurship, especially in innovation compared to other countries. So America has a rich culture of innovation. And it's like, well, proportionally compared to other countries, we might have a higher percentage, but a lot of people go in and they're wage slaves or they're at work just following rules and learning the common narratives. So it's like, oh, you can simultaneously say American culture has clearly is about obedience to authority, and we're seeing that now, even with a lot of people upset about lockdowns. There's not that many people who are actually, uprising about it, and people are rioting in like London about lockdowns, but not a lot of people are rioting here. And America's supposed to have this rich tradition of, freedom and anti-authoritarian streak. So it's like you can make all these claims that are seemingly conflicting because it's easy to draw broad narratives. So this is why I'm hesitant to ascribe anything, because it seems like it's not useful because it almost openly contradicts itself in ways that seem pretty apparent to me. Because it's hard to argue that most people don't go to school or work and then are obedient to authorities. And it's like, well, you can say a lot of them go home and complain about their teachers or bosses, but then they're still obedient and they don't start their own ventures. So it's like, okay, well, what does this even reflect on the average American or American culture or Americans' relationship with authority? And it's like, in the end, if you're basing things off these random facts about 300 million people, you're going to get a bunch of conflicting narratives because there are very few things that are clear, overwhelming majorities, and even clear, overwhelming majorities that are like 80-20 still have 20% of 300 million people going the other way. So it's like, okay, so it still doesn't describe 60 million people clearly. So that's why, like everything you just said, it's like, I mean, it's not like you're saying things that are outright wrong, but I'm just like, I don't think this is a helpful way of thinking. It doesn't seem helpful to use these terms, or it doesn't seem to clarify anything or to show. I don't think it can be used to prove anything in an argumentative setting. Like appealing to the American culture to make a point doesn't seem like it would ever be beneficial, because it seems like somebody can always show how your definition isn't necessarily right. So it's like, well, what's the point of using this type of phrase? That's why I'm having a hard time.
So I think there's like, I guess, two points I could make. Well, I'll make the first one, and then if you want to respond to what you can. If not, I'll move on to the second one. But I wanted to bring up a point you made about generalized statements about American culture disenfranchise certain groups. And I don't think that's the case, because the way I'm using American culture is anybody who lives in the United States and participates in American society, it is part of American culture. I mean, basically, the only way I wouldn't consider you a part of American culture at some level, if you really seclude yourself, is if you if you're a group of people that basically secludes themselves from the rest of the American population and just doesn't associate at some level. But there are, like, I'm not sure I can really think of any examples, or at least very few examples. I mean, what do you want to say? The Amish, like if there's a Muslim families in America, they're part of American culture. Jewish families, Catholic families,
Okay, so I like that you brought that up that way, because I think this gets to the point I'm trying to make, though. Because if you broaden it out enough to include both the avant-garde retired PhDs that have written academic papers and only listen to Beethoven, and you're saying, I'm going to use a cultural phrase that will encompass both them and then 16-year-old inner city kids that only listen to music that I can't comprehend, then it's like, okay, well, you're going to use a phrase that's supposed to encompass all their views on the arts. It doesn't really appeal to anybody, or it appeals to the average. You have to pick. So it's either broad enough to include all of it, but then what kind of points can you make using a phrase to appeal to everybody, it's too broad, or you have to make it narrow enough for it to not appeal to everybody. So then it's not helpful because it only appeals to a sliver of people who agree with the majority, the plurality. So it's like, that's why it's useless. It's either too broad or too narrow because it's a generalization, and it's an extreme generalization either way. So you either have to include people who are like Wall Street Journal readers and their tastes, or it has to either include them and like the polar opposite. So whatever first generation immigrants that don't think any of the same art or literature or entertainment is the same. So it has to include both of their preferences, or it has to include the average, which wouldn't include one of them, right? So it's like, okay, you either have a definition that can't include everybody, or you have one that does include everybody. But one's either too broad or too narrow. There's no way to have a definition that is like just right. You either have to include everybody, so it's not helpful, or it has to not include people to where you can only argue by appealing to American culture in very specific ways. So that's why like the term is like a mess.
You'll have to walk me through then. I guess, or you'll have to clarify as to why, if I broaden this out, that makes it meaningless, because I don't think it does. I know this guy goes to my school, and he's from a Muslim family. I would say he shares, and he's from somewhere in Asia. I've forgotten the country now, but his family moved to the United States, and I would say he is American, and I am American, and he shares American culture with me. Now his family comes from also a different cultural tradition that I don't come from. So he has certain ideas and values and outlooks that I wouldn't come from. But he is American and I am American, and I don't. That doesn't mean that American, that the word American means nothing, because again, we share a language.
We share
certain ideas.
But you were saying earlier that includes arts and things like that. So imagine a first generation immigrant that you're talking to, and it's like, yeah, sure, they're an American. I'm not disputing their status of being American, and I honestly have no values or opinions on other people's preferences because I don't care what other people think, right? So unfortunately for you, you want to enjoy your love for sports, and I use that as an example because I know you really love sports. So that's the example I use. You want to talk to this person about football, and you know that a lot of Americans love football, but unfortunately, they could not care less about American football. They only care about soccer. So we could use a term to say, well, American culture includes all the people who have moved to the United States and prefer other sports. It includes people who are first generation from Australia and still watch rugby, and all this stuff about all these other sports, and it's all included because we allow immigrants here. So American culture encompasses everything. So it's like, I'm fine with that definition. The problem is, if somebody's trying to use American culture as an identifier of what the average American person enjoys, then it's like, well, more Americans care about American football than they do soccer, right? It's like, or more Americans care about American football than golf. And it's like the amount of people who care about golf are separate based on certain preferences. Or if you looked at like soccer, it's going to be different demographic breakdowns. So what I'm saying is, I'm not saying one sport is more American than the other. I could not care less about what we deem one being more American than the other. What I'm saying is, if anybody asks you a question about the country, the United States, and was like, okay, we have this product we want to sell there, and then you appeal to American culture to think, will this product do good or not do good? It's like, okay, well, if you're actually appealing to Americans, you can argue that rugby is American because there's probably some amount of Australians that have moved to America and still watch rugby. So it's like, hey, even though you watch a sport that nobody else watches here, you're still American. It's like, I agree. But is a rugby product going to do amazing in the United States? It's like, no, because a lot of people don't know how rugby works. And that's fine. I don't really care. It's just, so it's kind of like, okay, we can include people who love rugby in the idea of American culture, but it's like not very helpful to include it in trying to understand things. Or when people appeal to, and I'm using sports because it's crude and easy to understand. But when we start appealing it to ideas, And then people make forecasts based on their ideas of saying, well, American culture is a culture of X, so people will be in favor of Y. It's like, okay, well, what does that even mean? Because people that are Americans have vastly warped views compared to other Americans. And just because we're both Americans that live here and can share a same recent history doesn't mean you can draw anything from it. That's why it's a loaded term for me. Was that a better example, I guess, of getting across why it's kind of has to choose between either being all encompassing or narrow?
I mean, I guess it's better in the sense I think I know what you're saying. I just disagree with it.
Well, okay. So I have a question now. I'll give you this question then, because maybe you can clarify to me where I'm going wrong with this. So why should rugby be included in American culture? Because Australians have moved here and still watch rugby. It's like, why should I think just because an Australian is here and they watch rugby and they're an American, enjoying rugby to some extent is a facet now of American culture? And if I do accept that, then what implications does that have on the usefulness of the term? Because that's the problem I'm running into in this example.
So I don't see a way. I don't see a way of talking about countries without using the term culture. I don't think. Well, I mean, here's another example. I'm going to sidestep your rugby example for a second here. So the guy I mentioned, the friend of mine, I think he's from Indonesia actually. And the Muslim guy from Indonesia. So like, I don't think that I wouldn't say his Islam or his Islamic values or his Islamic belief system. I wouldn't say that's a part of American culture. But the fact is, his family's moved to the United States, and so I'm sure he has absorbed in his thought process certain aspects of the American tradition or of American politics and just the American outlook on the world. So I don't have to say I'm not here, and I'm not saying that everything that an American does is necessarily a part of American culture. But I am saying, like I said at the very beginning of this podcast, we can have nuances. We can have people with very different views, very different outlooks, very different tastes, and still say they share something. They share a cultural. They have cultural ties to each other. We can still talk about American culture and speak about the nuances of the nuances of that individual differences bring into the conversation. And this is kind of where, like, I guess I have a hard time wrapping my head around certain like libertarian ANCAP intuitions, because it seems to me that most libertarians or ANCAPs do think that every man is an island, and that's just patently false. And this and this gets back somewhat into like the individualism collectivism debate, which we don't have to go down that rabbit hole. But I don't see a way that there has to be a way that we can talk about groups of people and the similarities that they share. And it seems to me that people who think like libertarians and ANCAPs, that they're not able to comprehend this because they're so stuck in this idea that of individualism. But we are not just individuals. And that kind of goes back to I share things in common with other Americans, even though I don't. Even though there's nobody in the U.S. that is exactly like me. But that doesn't invalidate that doesn't mean that I don't share things in common with you. That doesn't mean that you and I don't have cultural ties that bind us together, even though we're not the same human being.
Okay.
And if I can add one more quick point to what I'm saying, And this is kind of meant to trigger you.
I just want to jump in and say everything you said hasn't been applicable to me so far in this rant, so I'm fine with whatever you say because it's not applying, and I'll square up why it doesn't apply to me. I think we have a misunderstanding, so
that's fair. Okay, here's my somewhat triggering point. Libertarianism is a key part of, or rather, it is a symptom of American culture and American values. The Libertarian Party is almost like the quintessential American party at some level. There aren't. I'm not sure there's quite. You can really. You could probably find some slight parallels, but like libertarianism is it's a very American ideology. And so that that goes back to my point of like that's kind of another bit of proof in my mind of the existence of American culture is libertarianism. I would almost say that like if the founding fathers were like if they could find one party that would make the most sense to them from their limited 18th century perspective, it would be the Libertarian Party. I don't think the Democrat or Republican Party would really make sense to them because those parties have kind of diverged at some level from certain ideals of the founders. But like the Libertarians are kind of there like saying, no, we're kind of here to preserve the ideals of the founders. We truly care about liberty, and of course the founders spoke a lot about liberty. But when I think about American culture, I think like libertarianism makes sense. Libertarianism is like the best example at some level of a certain of America or an American outlook on the world. Even though the Libertarian Party is not in power, and most people don't vote Libertarian, I think libertarians talk about a lot of ideas which most Americans, not all, most Americans would agree with. So yeah, there's my slightly triggering point.
Okay, so everything you laid out about American about libertarians and their relationship to individualism and stuff like that. So to some extent, I think it's just a complete misunderstanding and over analyzing their end argument to apply their end argument to their actual philosophy. Because I know very few. I know very few libertarians that actually want to live in the woods and never talk to anybody again. It's more people are just allowed to do what they want, and it's their prerogative. But almost every libertarian that I listen to or talk to isn't a person that wants to isolate and not associate with anybody ever again. I am sympathetic to that line of thought because I do find a lot of people very annoying, but that's why I like niches so much, and I like finding the things I like, and then I identify with it a lot, and I think that works out. But the fact is, I understand the cultural influence of things. I just am making like an epistemological, almost postmodernist point that has nothing to do with my libertarianism. And I'm more saying I'm more criticizing the usefulness of terms that are supposed to be generalized, and then those terms can be defined in very different ways. And then depending on how you define them, they're going to be useful in completely different ways. And then they're often going to be then applied in ways that are not useful. So it seems silly to use this phrase because it's often used to make points that don't follow from the term. That's why I think the term is so silly. I'm not saying that there's no on average effect of certain institutions in a lot of people's lives. That's obviously true. It's obvious that if a lot of people went to public schools and a lot of public schools in the United States are ran a certain way, then there's generally this shared experience of people going to public schools that are, I guess, authoritarian to 8-year-olds. And then everybody can draw certain feelings and intuitions from this and then things that are taught and so forth. I'm not denying that those have impacts, like, because that'd be a stupid thing to say. I guess what I'm saying is when you examine a population, there are going to be huge extremes in the population, but the huge extremes aren't just extremes because it's kind of like when we talk about the idea of the working class. It's like, well, the working class or people in unions can actually have completely different priorities within that group of people. that's why I think it's so disgusting when I hear people who are essentially people who argue they're pro-worker act like a policy can be pro-worker when almost every policy would be good for some people and bad for others that are workers. So you can't say something's pro-worker if there's like 30% of workers would be screwed by it. So this happens all the time. So you use the phrase in your rant, and I don't even know what the whole sentence was, but I just jotted it down. You said an American outlook on the world. Well, the thing is, if you pull 30 Americans and ask them their outlook on the world in any question, you're going to get completely different answers. So it's like, okay, I'll agree with you that there are certain shared things that on average will be true because of certain things we're all exposed to. But it's not useful to say that an American outlook on the world exists, because if you actually ask 30 Americans, you get completely different answers. So it's like, sure, you can say abstractly in a platonic way, something does exist. But anytime somebody uses a phrase that appeals to it, they're almost always using that phrase in a way that is probably wrong, descriptively. Because if you actually polled people and asked, you'd get a bunch of wrong answers. So it's one of those things where you can make up an average, or you can make up something that could be real. But if you actually try to put it in practice, it doesn't matter, and it's not necessarily applicable. And this can be applied to any issue that encompasses American culture. So it's kind of like, what's the point unless you want to narrow it down? And I think the easy answer is to narrow it down. I think the easy answer is to say, when I talk about American culture, I'm talking about things that Americans are for on average. So you'll talk about the biggest box office movies. You can talk about the most famous movies that most Americans would say are their favorites. And you could say things like, this is a cultural relic, not because everybody likes it, but because the most commonly named movie when you ask an American their favorite movie is this. And it's like, okay, so if we took 10 people off the street, more will give us this answer. And this can be descriptive in some way, and we can use this information in a bounded way to make points. But it's like, instead, you're like, let's encompass everybody because everybody's technically an American, and we know that there are American influences on everybody in an area. And it's like, okay, that's true. That's true. Technically, you can say everybody has been exposed to this. But then you have to ask the question, to what extent? And it's like, okay, so we all have these shared roots of living in a country that used to be owned by a different country hundreds of years ago. What does that mean? It's like, well, some people that's going to mean a lot to them or have long impacts through their family tradition. And some people that's going to have pretty much no effect in their tangible life at all. So it's going to have wide variances of uses depending on the people you're talking to, which is pretty much immeasurable. So you might as well be talking about one of Plato's theories. So it's just like, if you ever refer to it in conversation while you're trying to make an actual tangible point, it's like, we can't measure the validity of it. You're saying something abstract. So it just seems useless. And I'm not saying that it's not potentially correct in theory. I'm just saying, if you appeal to it in conversation, you can't really prove that what you're saying is right. You're appealing to a feeling and an intuition that you have that other people might have to less of an extent, and other people might have to a lot of an extent. So it's just like, what's the point of thinking about it in the not narrow way? I'm not saying it's necessarily like wrong. I'm just saying it's not a tool. And usually terms that are generalizations are a tool if you're talking about like a policy. So I don't think it's a useful term. So then if you narrow it down, you can actually make quantitative claims, I guess, or you can make claims that are potentially verifiable. But that it doesn't square with the philosophical idea that everybody's encompassed, because it clearly would disenfranchise everybody who doesn't say like The Notebook's their favorite movie or something like that. Right. So you can't have it both ways unless you go out of your way to separate the two in theory. So yeah, I didn't even respond to the libertarian part because I just don't think it's applicable. I don't think a lot of libertarians who believe in the non-aggression principle, I don't think it follows from the non-aggression principle that nobody's ever influenced your societal beliefs or your intuitions. So yeah, you don't even need to add that layer of analysis to just believe in the axioms of libertarianism. If somebody influences you because of shared history, that's cool, but that has nothing to do with thinking taxation's theft. You could say it does because the founders, et cetera, et cetera. I understand that might be what's going on in your head right now, and that's fine. I'm making a very different point. I'm saying, if somebody was literally looking at a piece of paper and it said the libertarian axioms, you can agree those are true, and then also agree that man is not an island. So it's just not a fact conclusion topic. So I just don't think it's relevant to like the literal point we're making. So I don't know if that's even a road to go down. So yeah, that's me being pissed. So thank you for listening to my TED Talk.
I mean, okay. I think we're getting somewhere. I want to say maybe not. I don't know. And I say that because I don't actually disagree with a lot of what you just said. I let me clarify. Okay, so I don't disagree. I don't disagree that the cultural analysis or the concept of American culture or just culture in general is not. I agree that it's used in poor ways and people talk about it in a sloppy fashion, and they're not precise in their language. I agree that if you poll 30 Americans, they're not going to have the same outlook on. They're not going to have the same answers to all questions that you would ask them. So I think in my analysis, and I've tried to make that clear in this conversation, but I do take into account the a distinction between the general and the specific. So anyone who is a U.S. citizen is an American, and even you could even make the argument that even people who aren't technically citizens but live here, or like this is their permanent residence, you could even say they're Americans. They're just not Americans, and they're just not Americans in the sense of being a registered citizen. But then then we get into like certain then we get into what you're saying, which is the like an average belief or like the belief of the majority or the belief in of like the average person who lives in this country. And I think to illustrate this, I will just talk a little bit more about why I brought up libertarianism in the first place, because I'm not trying to mischaracterize libertarians, but I think this point is relevant. So like here's a really easy example off the top of my head. Americans as a whole have a pretty antagonistic relationship with the government. Again, can you find examples of Americans who think the government maybe can do no wrong, or they're always willing to let the government in on a particular issue or use the government for certain ends? Yeah, of course. And I'm willing to use the government for certain ends. But what is libertarianism all about at some level? It's at the level of, government is evil, government is wrong, you should question the government. And I think that's a very American thing to say. That's a very American argument to make. If you go to certain European countries, you don't have the same attitude. They don't have, certain. I'm hesitant to say particular countries, but I think many Europeans of different countries, they don't have the same antagonistic relationship with the government, at least they don't have the same antagonistic outlook towards the government. They see the government as your friend. I think the average American doesn't really see the government as your friend. It sees the government as, this institution just kind of gets in the way of things. Just stay out of my way as much as possible, and you're good. Libertarians, that they're all about personal responsibility and the allowing individuals to make their own choices. Again, I think most Americans would go along with that. This gets into polling, of course, which I know you don't like, but if you poll Americans, most Americans want marijuana to be legalized. Quite a few Americans probably want even more drugs to be legalized, and believe that if you're 18, you should be able to drink and get a cigarette, do what you want with your body because it's your body. So I just think that I think libertarians are. It kind of almost goes back to a strict interpretation of the Constitution, but I do think libertarians at some level are carrying the torch of values that the founding fathers espoused, for better or for worse. So I guess in short, I am willing to make. I agree with you in that we do need to be careful and not to blur the specific and the general. And I think that when I talk about culture, I am careful to I am careful to point out when I am being when I am speaking in general terms and when I am speaking in specific terms.
So maybe what this episode is less about my hatred towards the phrase American culture, and it's more my hatred towards phrases that could be used often in public discord that are almost buzzwordy or heuristics. So like the example you gave, I think is really good in the sense that it's like if you compare the United States to Europe, a lot of us hate the government a lot more than Europe. But it's like so somebody in good faith can say American culture is hating the government, et cetera, and then they could cite a bunch of stuff about us hating it versus Europe, and it's like that's cool, but it depends on the measuring stick, right? Because it's easy to use that phrase like, okay, you've done that proof, therefore this is an element of American culture. But then I can sit here and I can just paint the other narrative that's despite the United States having a rich history of hating the government and fighting back against the government, in the day-to-day life, people are overwhelmingly compliant on almost everything. And there is a large faction of voters that want the government to have an increasing presence in everyday life. And a lot of people defer to experts that work in government. And I can lay out the case of, despite being more rebellious than Europe, a lot of people are obedient to the government, would not think about resisting the government, and is okay with deferring to experts in government on a plethora of issues. And then it's like, okay, well, so you can go back and forth. And in the end, it's like, well, what it comes down to is it's why talking in generalizations can be confusing and bad. Because we could both make a case for why American culture is either about being obedient or being a dissident. And both of us could have good reasons to back up what we have to say. And in the end, it's like, well, maybe this is why phrases that could be disputed aren't that good. And then, and it's also, it's like, and us having this conversation is 15 layers deeper than anybody on CNN would go. Because on CNN, they're the ones who throw out phrases like, obviously, that this is an American policy, universal health care, because Americans are caring. And like you and I would be like, well, what does it even mean? And then it's like, well, at least try to make arguments for our side and then our policy if we're even going to have a conversation. And I use healthcare lazily as an example, but I'm just trying to illustrate how if you throw on cable news, they're so lazy and it takes for granted whatever they're saying. You don't question it. It's just thrown out there and will never be delved into. But it's like, I just think there's a huge problem with using these terms because you can define them in about 8 different ways that are somewhat valid. And then that's why I painted the broad idea of American culture and then the narrow one is because I'm like, I think both of these are pretty valid in different contexts. But the hard part is it's hard to think of times they're useful because they're very narrow or very broad. And then it's like, what kind of points can you make? How is this useful in an argument? If somebody drops this phrase and it means this, could you ever even make a persuasive point? Or is it too vague? Is it unprovable? So it's like, the idea of this topic brought on a meta topic of what can we even understand when we talk about 300 million people at once, and what kind of narratives can we draw about 300 million people in the world today if we talk about stuff that happened 250 years ago. And I think you would confidently say we can draw some things from it. The Libertarian Party still tries to illustrate foundational values that came from the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So there is some influence, right? You were saying that they're like the torch carriers for the founding fathers to some extent, or at least the ones that agreed on the things the Libertarian Party agrees on. It's not like they completely disagreed on a ton of issues at the time. So it's like there is some influence that clearly carries on, and that is obviously true, and that's an important thing to recognize. I guess what we're quibbling over and we've argued about for an hour is to what degree and how useful. And I would probably say generalizations in general you should be wary of. Jordan Peterson definitely has a rule on that, like be precise with your language. That's what I'm criticizing the media for. And that's why I'm just like, I don't like the phrase. Maybe it's true to some extent. It definitely is true to some extent, but I don't think it's useful. I think it's imprecise. But a lot of the points you made to back up your version of it are true. I agree. Like I'm in agreement with a lot of your examples. I just don't think it proves the whole thing that we should use it, and that's a helpful phrase. And that's why I yelled at you. And you get yelled at sometimes. That's our deal. I get to yell at Matt. Matt gets to calm me down, and then I apologize profusely at the end of the episode. That's how these things work. So to some extent, we probably made some progress. So I'll let you jump on, but we should probably wrap up at some point. But feel free to open up another can of worms because I can always yell more if I need to.
Well, there's just two things I want to bring up, and one of them might open up a can of worms. We'll see. I'll just make two quick points, and then you can respond to whatever ones or none of them. Well, it's live your life. It's a free country. Okay, so I wanted to quickly explain myself a little more when I was bringing up libertarianism and libertarian philosophy. So again, I'm not trying to mischaracterize libertarians, but I think a distinction between myself and libertarians is I am willing to look at people, or I am willing to put, in certain contexts, I'm willing to put an emphasis on it. This is probably a bad phrase, but I at the moment I can't think of a better phrase. Group identity. I think you agree with me, of course. Humans are social animals. Man is not an island. We agree. All right. But I'm willing to talk about people's group identity along with their own individual identity, and I think libertarians in general that they just because of their presuppositions and intuitions, they just seem to think that any talk of group identity is invalid because of variations within groups. So that was really my point about that. And then the other quick point.
We should stop at that point then. I guess what I'd say is I don't think they're not willing to talk about it that way. I just think they approach those conversations with extreme skepticism. And I think that extreme skepticism is worrying. I mean, is worth worrying about, because if you're talking about the workers, right? If you're at a company and you guys do a vote to unionize, and you're in a state that only needs 50% of votes to unionize, and it's like, oh, well, they voted to unionize. It's like, okay, but it's like if they vote 60 to 40, or do they vote 90 to 10? And it's like, well, if they voted 60 to 40, do 40% of the people really, really disagree? And if you're talking about the workers, does the phrase the workers actually apply to half the people? It's like sometimes they don't at all. And it's like, well, then maybe that generalization is not helpful because it won't apply to a bunch of people in a group. Maybe. So it's like, I guess we're quicker to point out when people argue in favor of something, but then you can clearly see that 40% of a group isn't actually helped by it. So it makes us skeptical of a lot of those generalizations. That's how I feel about it, and that's how I feel about it. That's how a lot of libertarians that attack against identity politics and stuff would phrase it too, I think.
That's fair, but I would say that I'm more willing to talk about groups in terms of generalizations, because I think that is useful in as long as you're aware of what you're doing.
See, I don't think people are usually aware of what they're doing. That's why I think it's so harmful. So I think that's where we really.
I think I am. So that's all I'm concerned about, because I'm an egotist. Can
I? Yeah. You can go to the second point. That's fine.
I want to go to my second point. So I want to take I guess what would be in your mind the most big government guy, one of the most big government guys in U.S. history, FDR. And I'm gonna say another possibly triggering statement. FDR was suspicious of the government. It's like, wait, what? Matthew? Why'd you say that? He did all these government programs. What are you talking about? He expanded government power. Are you crazy? He wasn't suspicious of the government. He used the government. He was suspicious of the government in the sense that he was worried, like many Americans were at the time, that due to the Great Depression, America was going to go in two directions. America was going to become fascist or communist. And both both ideologies, at least historically, have led to centralized, highly bureaucratic governments. Governments which are basically control every aspect of your life. And so, what did FDR do? FDR he did use the government, but he was using the government in certain ways in order that the government did not control people. In order that the government did not have influence in other ways. So he was very specific in his in what he wanted the government to be doing, because he thought the government should not be doing very specific things that a fascist or a communist would think the government should be doing. So, and that's almost why like I have a hard time believing that like communism or fascism will ever really arise in this country, due to people's innate suspicion, or not innate, but due to the cultural suspicion of governments as a whole. So at some level, it's like even the most big government people in this country, they are suspicious of governments or of the government, but they use the government in order to they use the government for certain things in order to check the government's power in other ways.
Well, but isn't like every famously fascist country deeply corrupt? And if you're in a deeply corrupt government and you're in charge of a deeply corrupt government, you'd be skeptical of government. So it's like I don't really think your argument follows in the sense that it's like those officials don't trust the government, and then they all led fascist governments too. And I think the big concern isn't that people are willing to question government. I don't think that's what keeps us from fascism. I think the real thing people are concerned about is the overwhelming compliance. So people will really raise alarms about things and say, "Oh my God, I can't believe X, Y, and Z might happen." And then it's like the odds of anybody doing anything is very low, because there's really not a reason to do anything most of the time, because you're going to put yourself at outsized risk because the government's allowed to shoot you in the head if you try to defend yourself. So it's like, well, of course we're obedient. So I don't know. It depends on the barometer you use for fascism, though, and the barometer you use for authoritarianism, and we've had arguments about that too. Because I don't know, it bugs me that I know a lot of people. One of my buddies just got a job that he's on salary for the first time of his life, and he just got paid for the first time. And then he's like, "Oh, everything Matt says is right," because wow, nobody says anything about how we all get a third of our income just robbed from us straight up, and there's nothing I can do about it except vote harder. So it's like the barometer is different for everyone. You and I disagree on the barometer. I see overwhelming compliance with people getting a third of their stuff stripped from them and then not really having a voice. I would probably argue that the founding fathers were statists, because the founding fathers, their rallying cry was no taxation without representation. And I think representation is a poor excuse of a justification for taxation, you know? So, I mean, I don't know. I do. And also on the FDR point specifically, like we each need to watch like a 1 or 2 hour video that each of us recommends, because you have wildly different perceptions of FDR. And I don't think it's only ideological. I think it also has to do with the kind of messaging that both of our sides give us about FDR. So I'm sure you know 10 anecdotes about FDR and I know none of them. And I'm sure I know 10 anecdotes about FDR that you don't know, because you hear usually the fond of FDR side, and I hear the disgusted by FDR side. So appealing to FDR is like, I'm skeptical, but it's like, I know we know different things about FDR. So yeah, but that's my rant about obedience to government, and how I don't think a leader who is skeptical of government means the government will not get worse. It's just in that situation, it's an example where FDR tried to not give them, I guess, more power to some extent because he didn't trust them. I don't know. Maybe I'm cursed from the basis of your point, because I do think we live in an authoritarian country, and you don't. So maybe I'm not the one who should be listening to what you have to say on that point, because I'm already sold that we're already there. Especially because it was illegal for me to go to my mom's house for Thanksgiving this week, and I definitely went. So maybe that's also part of why we really don't connect on any of the points on that issue. But feel free to get a last word in on that front, and then I'll sign us off, because we've been going at it for about an hour and change.
Um, not sure there's much more to add to the conversation. I think pretty much what we've said is I'm willing to leave it at that. We will obviously return to this topic as we return to every single topic we've ever talked about in future episodes.
You know, I always think we do make some progress sometimes. Like in this episode, I did think we made some progress on a little bit on talking about generalizations and at least acknowledging that they should be used carefully. Like you at least agreed with that, which is more than I guess I expected, because that's not a commonly held view when you talk to people. Because people will all the time throw out generalizations. I do it, and when I'm called out on it, I'm like kind of thankful for it because it means I made a bad point, and I always want to make a better point. So I do like to believe we've made ground, even though everything we argue about, like authoritarianism and consent and democracy and positive versus negative rights and FDR being a fascist, all of those things do come up every 5 episodes. So if you want to tune into the ongoing debate, you'll have to check out our next episode. That'll probably come out next week. And if you want to revisit past classics, like us talking about positive and negative rights and arguing there, or arguing about a whole slew of things, feel free to check out our catalog. You can find us on any podcatcher, or you can find our lovely faces as we get very angry at each other while we're muted, waiting for the other person to finish ranting. You could do that by searching The Anti-Philosopher and Beyond Talking Points on YouTube. I also just Googled Beyond Talking Points the other day, and if you just Google Beyond Talking Points, like I think either like our podcast either comes up or like some of the YouTube videos does. So if you're too lazy to go on YouTube and type in all the like 6 words, just Google Beyond Talking Points and you're bound to get some sort of direction to find the rest of our content. So please check that out if you have the time, and I hope you enjoyed hearing us bicker and making like incredibly nuanced points about surprisingly philosophical epistemological issues. I like to think we're better than the cable news I'm going to go back listening to in about an hour when I cook dinner. So thank you guys for listening. We truly appreciate it. And signing off, it's Mad Matt.